god, that was terrible.
I'm so sorry you had to see that. Welcome everyone to another calendar year of, if I can get this to a point where I can see. Welcome to another calendar year of Vinyl Monday. I'm Abby, and this is the who, what, when, where, why, and how do I feel about classic albums in my collection. And I constantly struggle with my bangs and hats. If deep dives aren't your thing, don't worry. I also do Vinyl Monday in 60 seconds here on my channel, over on my Instagram, as well as TikTok. We are back, and here we are at the much anticipated 50,000 subscriber special. Thank you so much for being patient with me. This was not an easy one to get together, and thank you for choosing this channel to support through all of its endeavors, including season 2 of the Dolls podcast. I wrote the season premiere about the Beatles' beloved secretary and fan club president, good ol' Frida Kelly. So if you need a palate cleanser after this, the Dolls Pod on Apple and Spotify is linked in the description. This week's album, who am I kidding? You already know what it is. I've been teasing it for months. It's Trout Mask Replica. Congrats if you guessed this one. Remember, if you want to play along, all you gotta do is check out my community tab. That's where I post hints to next week's episode, I make announcements, I host polls. You can find all of that on my channel. And if you so choose, you can always read the written version of the review on my website, linked in the description. All right, let's take the plastic off. So my copy is a repress from Jack White's record label Third Man Records. This was from 2018, I think. It was an early Christmas gift. As B-roll, Abby will be showing you right about now. This was pressed on multicolored marble wax called Fruitcake Fish Scale. I'd say that's a pretty accurate descriptor. It features a lyric booklet with illustrations by the Mascara Snake, liner notes by Jack White, a Trout patch replica, a replica Trout mask, a canvas tote bag to show everybody at the record store that you're better than them because you get Trout mask replica, and the Pachuco Cadaver single with Wildlife on the B-side, on white vinyl. Now, let's talk about this cover art. The Trout Mask Replica cover photo was shot by Cal Schenkel. He's worked on a number of Zappaverse covers, including this, and this. We see the captain himself in his green Afghan coat, a hat with a badminton birdie stuck on top, and this will go down in history as the most disgusting story I will ever share on a Vinyl Monday, because the Trout mask was real. Cal found this fish head at the market, bought it, took it home, and hollowed it out for Beefheart to wear, which he did for the entirety of the 2-hour shoot. There's some footage of this shoot floating around. Oh, I cannot begin to imagine the smell. Oh. I think I need to go. The back cover and gatefold were shot by Ed Cariff in the backyard of the band's shared house. On Trout Mask Replica, we have the man, the myth, the legend, Don Van Vliet, aka Captain Beefheart. On lead vocals, saxophone, and something called a musette, which is most like a mini bagpipe. He is accompanied by his magic band, consisting of his cousin Victor Hayden, aka the Mascara Snake. On bass clarinet, saxophone, and backing vocals, he can also be heard on Pina. Bill Harkleroad, or as he will be known henceforth, Zoothorn Rollo, on guitar, and glass appendage slide. Jeff Cotton, aka Antenna Jimmy Siemens, on guitar, steel appendage slide, something called a flesh horn on Ellagaroo, and spoken word on Pina and the Blimp. Mark Boston, or Rockette Morton, plays bass, and on drums, Drumbo. Duh. His name is John French. He also wrote the arrangements. Special guests include Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. Frank can be heard on Pina and the Blimp.
Again, beginning.
Multi-instrumentalist extraordinaire Ian MacDonald plays the sax with Bunk Gardner. Buzz Gardner plays the trumpet, Don Preston on piano, Roy Estrada on bass, and Art Tripp, soon to become Ed Marimba, plays drums. Ex-Magic Band member Doug Moon plays guitar on China Pig. Gary, aka Magic Marker, pretty straightforward name, plays bass on Moonlight in Vermont and Veterans Day Poppy. Neighbor Kids can be heard on Hair Pie 1, and according to Zoothorn, we don't know who's monologuing at the end of Dachau. Quote, "This was just some guy who showed up at the house. He came into the house and started telling this story, and Don made him stop and repeat it so he could put it on the tape deck." Trout Mask Replica was produced by Frank Zappa, engineered by Dick Kunk. Roll transition. How did this happen? Trout Mask Replica simply would not have happened without the storied friendship of Don Van Vliet and Frank Zappa. While little Frank grew up to form the Mothers of Invention, little Don grew up to form Captain Beefheart and his magic band. Captain Beefheart was supposed to be Don's character in this movie idea Zappa had, but the Captain Beefheart name specifically came from Don's girlfriend's funny uncle. His penis was so mangled it resembled cow organs. Ugh. I don't need to rehash the story of Bizarre Records. I've already done it in the Permanent Damage episode and the Hot Rats episode, and I'm inevitably going to have to do it again for a We're Only in It for the Money episode, but I will go into how Don wound up on Bizarre. Not unlike Frank and Verve, Don had difficult relationships with all three of his past labels, A&M, Kama Sutra, and Blue Note. A&M hoped for a whole album of Diddy Wah Diddies, instead they got Safe as Milk. They rejected it, but Kama Sutra accepted. Then came the It Comes to You in a Plain Brown Wrapper project. Kama Sutra rejected it. They wanted Safe as Milk too, and Brown Wrapper is much more of a proto-Trout Mask. So, Don and co. jumped ship again to Blue Note. As the story goes, Strictly Personal, as it became, was maimed by producer Bob Krasnow. He was high on LSD, he added flanging all over the place. Don was pissed. The band went on a successful tour of Europe, but somewhere along the way, either a manager or a booking agent ran off with all their money. They returned to California, tails between their legs, but who just returned from his residency at the Garrick Theater but one Frank Zappa? The old friends reunited at a KFC of all places, not known for their beef or fish, and Don confided in Frank over his legal woes. Turns out, Frank was having similar problems, and hey, he's forming a label with his manager, and it's gonna be all about creative freedom. Why don't you join? Of course this was a breach of contract with Kama Sutra. I'm not totally sure how Blue Note comes into play, but I'm sure they weren't happy either. Kama Sutra threatened to sue for money the Magic Band just didn't have, but Herbie Cohen wriggled their way out of it so they could sign with Bizarre. The band moved into their house on Esnada Drive in Woodland Hills, and in fall of '68, work begins on the next LP. Trout Mask sessions actually began as an attempt to re-record Strictly Personal. The idea was to mold it into what Brown Wrapper was supposed to be. Candy Corn was re-recorded but never saw the light of day. Moonlight on Vermont and Veterans Day Poppy were cut too. But of course, in October, Blue Note released Krasnow's Strictly Personal. Brown Wrapper was abandoned. Forced back to square one, Don brought Trout Mask into the world. It's well known nowadays that Captain Beefheart subjected his band to psychological torture. This is not hyperbole. This is not a joke. Don Van Vliet violated the fucking Geneva Convention. It started slow, but over time, Don enacted a suffocating routine. He ran rehearsals for 12 hours a day, deprived his musicians of sleep by either going on hours-long rants or playing music at all hours of the day to strip them of any conventional musical foundations. Goodbye blues scales, hello God. Neighbors called to complain about the noise, but every time, officers wrote it off as weirdo hippie antics and left them be. The guys were hungry, they didn't shower, they slept on the floor of the living room. As detailed in the artist formerly known as Captain Beefheart, only one member of the band was allowed to leave the house once a week to get groceries. He cut them off from friends, family, and label mates. The band missed out on the big Shrine exposition. This was kept up for between 6 and 9 months. For over half a year, these musicians were cut off from the outside world in an avant-rock petri dish. All they did was play music, listen to said music, and smoke a metric ton of weed. GTO Miss Pamela describes dropping by one of these fever dream rehearsals in her book. She happened upon the guys listening to Steve Reich's on repeat, as they often did with songs. She stood in a circle with Beefheart, Zoothorn, Mascara Snake, and Drumbo. They were all holding hands. She was trying to get her eyes to roll with the music, go in one direction, stop, and then go in the other, but she was so stoned out of her gourd she couldn't control her eyes. Now imagine 9 months of that, but overworked, underfed, and locked in a house. You may be asking, how the hell did this happen? Keep in mind, this is 1968 through 1969. These guys were 19, 20, 21 years old. They were dirt poor, not married, not in school, so the draft affected them the most. Don used all levels of these guys' fear, from existential to personal, to erode their trust in each other, and they'd be completely loyal to him. This was especially effective on Zoothorn, who had just gotten out of a literal, actual cult. As described by Zappa biographer Billy James, quote, "These guys' spirits, wills, and everything about them was broken down, so where they were only functioning for what Don wanted them to do, and that was it." While the guys were held against their will, they weren't playing this music against their will. An outsider might see this as Stockholm Syndrome, but I see it as musicians having fun with stuff that's really technically difficult to play. It took some getting used to, but they really liked that challenge. It's why they put up with so much of Don's shit. Okay, so sonically, how the hell did we get here? We have Gary Marker to thank. He introduced Don to Stockhausen, the aforementioned Steve Reich, Pauline Oliveira, Ornette Coleman, Archie Shepp, and of course, Albert Eiler. Then Gary got the hell out of Dodge. Good for him. Though Don tried his best to peel back his blues roots, he incorporated blues holler, talking blues, and Delta and Chicago blues styles into his performance. After seeing Zappa and Ian Underwood play on piano, Don decided he wanted to write on piano. Don could not play piano. A long-held myth about this album is that Don wrote the whole thing by himself on the piano. Another is that Trout Mask is all random parts played on top of each other, and Don's vocals were dubbed in. Neither of these are true. Trout Mask was a carefully orchestrated group effort. Listen to Grow Fins. The demos are near identical to what wound up on the LP. As described by Drumbo, quote, "There was a sense of total urgency, and you better be totally committed to catching it while it was there. The guys would be running around trying to find their tape recorder while Don was banging out something unannounced. Drumbo grew so sick of this, he broke the tape recorder. Of course, he became de facto transcriber, stitching together Don's little bursts of inspiration. This task was not for the faint of heart. See, the piano has 88 keys, and Don didn't understand that the piano can play notes outside of a guitar or bass's range. Trout Mask sessions finally began in March of 1969 at Woodland Hills. The original concept was field recordings, inspired by Zappa's recent tour and Wildman Fisher's album. We hear this in songs like The Dust Blows Forward.
What am I gonna die? A white flake riverboat just...
But Don wasn't happy with this at all. He accused Zappa of being a cheapskate and demanded the project be moved to Sunset Sound. But there was a catch. They'd only have 6 hours to record the whole thing. That turned out to be no problem. The music was so ingrained in these guys' heads that, according to Zoothorn, they could bang out most everything in 1 or 2 takes. Never 3. The only exception to this was Orange Claw, which took 2 hours. Additional work took place at Whitney. The antics did not end at the studio, nay nay. Don bought 20 sleigh bells just for Hobo Changba and refused to wear headphones. He said Zappa fell asleep at the board and Dick Kunk did all the work. None of the other band members agree with this, though. They say Zappa was present and active. The album was finished on Easter Sunday, 1969. Don got all the guys together, dressed in their Sunday best for a listening party. They apparently loved it. The track listing of Trout Mask Replica goes as follows. Opening up disc 1, we have Frownland, followed by The Dust Blows Forward and The Dust Blows Back. Then Dachau Blues, next Ella Guru, then Hair Pie Bake 1, and side 1 closes with Moonlight on Vermont. Opening up side 2, we have Pachuco Cadaver, followed by Bill's Corpse, then Sweet Sweet Bulbs, Neon Meat Dream of a Octofish, China Pig, then My Human Gets Me Blues, and disc 1 closes with Dali's Car. Opening up disc 2, we have Hair Pie Bake 2, followed by Pina, then Well, next When Big Jones Sets Up, Fallen Ditch, Sugar and Spike, and side 3 closes with Ant-Man Bee. Opening up side 4, we have Wildlife, followed by She's Too Much for My Mirror, then Hobo Chang Ba, next The Blimp with subtitle Mousetrap Replica, then Steal Softly Through Snow, Old Fart at Play, and the album closes with Veterans Day Poppy. Trout Mask Replica was released June 16th, 1969 to mass hysteria and confusion. This thing flopped like a fish. Think about the state of the world in 1969. Things were changing faster than anyone could comprehend. The Vietnam War was escalating, scarring an entire generation of young men. The counterculture was getting more radical. This was the summer of putting a man on the moon, Woodstock, and the Tate LaBianca murders. While there were some grand statements still, as a whole, people sought comforting sounds in music. CSN, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Joni Mitchell, and then there's this. If rock critics and mainstream audiences at the time couldn't handle Zappa, this was way out of their grasp. Since its release, many writers have tried to articulate why Trout Mask works. Lester Bangs hailed Trout Mask as, quote, a total success, a brilliant, stunning enlargement and clarification of Dawn's art, which is not to say it's in any sense slick, artistic, or easy. This is one of a few bands whose sound has actually gotten rawer as they've matured, a brilliant and refreshing strategy. Les likens Trout Mask to a rock equivalent of players like Cecil Taylor, Albert Eiler, and Don Cherry, spotlighting Hair Pie 1 as a musical challenge similar to what Charlie Parker presented to jazz in the 50s. He described the lyrics as total stream of consciousness, and the final line of his review was co-opted by full-page ads for the album. It, quote, may well be the most unusual and challenging musical experience you'll have this year. After writing that review, Les became friends with Beefheart. In a later piece for The Village Voice, Les said, quote, like almost all of Beefheart's recorded work, Trout Mask was not even ahead of its time in 1969. Then and now, it stands outside time, trends, fads, hypes, the rise and fall of whole genres, eclectic as walking Christmas trees, constituting a genre unto itself. The band, under his tutelage, thereon reinvented from the ground up rhythm, melody, harmonics, perhaps what our common narrow parameters have defined as music itself. Speaking of The Village Voice, Chris Gow wanted to give this an A, but couldn't bring himself to do it as it was too fucking weird. Quote, very great, played at high volume when you're feeling shitty, because you'll never feel as shitty as this record. Which is chillingly similar to the comment I wrote on Fantano's Angelic to the Core review. In his review for Trout Mask follow-up Lick My Decals Off Baby, Ed Ward said, quote, when I first heard Trout Mask Replica, I about puked. What is this shit? I thought. People I met talked about it in glowing terms. Not just anybody, mind you, but people I genuinely respected when it came to their musical tastes. Well, I figured everyone has their little whatchamacallits. But who cares about Rolling Stone? What about Cream? In the August 69 issue, Kick out the jams, motherfucker! Richard C. Walls attempted to decipher what the hell is going on. Quote, breath control backwater vocals, a raunchy range of genres represented, including, quote, teen thrill Ella Guru, okay, and Allen Ginsberg parody, Octofish, accomplished musicianship and mercurial arrangements. Rich Boyle's Trout Mask down to Free Association, which honestly makes for kind of a disappointing review. Oh! By all accounts, Trout Mask did what it was supposed to do. It beat just about everything else on the market at the time, even landed a Rolling Stone cover in 1970 and a spot on the Actuel Pop and Jazz Festival in Amougy, Belgium, sharing sharing the bill with Trout Mask muse Archie Shepp, future prog kings Pink Floyd, and fusion pioneers The Soft Machine. But after this iteration of the Magic Band completely fell apart. The guys were broke. Mentally, physically, emotionally, and financially. Drumbo was fired, but came back. Kunk was fired during decal sessions, and Tenna Jimmy quit after getting in a fist fight with replacement drummer Jeff Burchell that left Jimmy with several broken ribs. As for the Captain, Trout Mask is both his most iconic album and his career killer. To fans, he could never top its exalted weirdness. To everyone else, it ruined any semblance of legitimacy he had. Don grew to resent Zappa, thinking him and Bizarre made him look like a fool. A freak, if you will. He left Bizarre after decals taking Mirror Man to Buddha Records. This is now his 5th label in 6 years. Don and Frank had a number of reconciliations and fallings out over the years, finally working things out before Frank's passing. Trout Mask's legacy is just as baffling as it is immense and wide-reaching. It inspired Joe Strummer, Tom Waits, Devo, the B-52s, Beck, PJ Harvey, and of course the White Stripes. A supergroup of Bauhaus's Peter Murphy and Japan's Mick Karn named themselves after Dali's car. Trout Mask, along with Physical Graffiti, inspired Sonic Youth to make Daydream Nation a double album. There's a surprising number of Trout Mask cover albums, and Captain Beefheart and the greater Zappa Verse's colorful, zany humor no doubt inspired Simpsons creator Matt Groening.
Maybe I better get over another play. So I played it again, and I thought, it sounds horrible, but they mean it to sound this way. And about the 3rd or 4th time, it started to grow on me. And the 5th or 6th time, I loved it. And the 7th or 8th time, I thought it was the greatest album ever made, and I still do.
Trout Mask is preserved in the Library of Congress as a culturally significant recording. It's on the 2003 and 2012 iterations of Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Albums of All Time lists. For a long time, Trout Mask was off streaming services. While I was writing this video, it was re-uploaded, it looks like it was pulled over a rights negotiation with the Zappa Trust, and it looks like it's here to stay. One can only hope for permanent damage to be on streaming. Today, Trout Mask stands as a musical rite of passage. Either you get it or you don't, and if you don't, you can't sit at the cool kids table. I think this principle is lame and also wrong. What else do I think about Trout Mask Replica?
A squid eating dough in a polyethylene bag is fast and bulbous. Got me?
David Fricke became one of my favorite music writers after my classic albums binge. I went poking around the Rolling Stone archives for some of his work. One of the last substantial things of his Rolling Stone has published was a 50th anniversary retrospective of Trout Mask. It was hard not to be swayed by such descriptors as improbably severe angles in ice-pick treble, broken bones slicing through skin, U-turn spasms of loose limb time and tempo, and, quote, hellhound bass to whacked falsetto. Fricke's writing inspired me to try Trout Mask for myself. People's experiences with Trout Mask can generally be filed into 3 categories. Number 1, immediately recognizes as genius. Number 2, what the f*** is this shit? Turn it off! And 3, starting out hating it, then growing to understand it. I had to try for Trout Mask. I worked on this video for over a month, and I only made it all the way through this album in one sitting twice. I'll say what everyone is thinking. This is a lot for one album. A 28-song double album of some of the most mangled shit ever put to tape. Some call it unlistenable, and they're kinda right. As a double album package, Trout Mask Replica is damn near unlistenable. Around Big Joan, the fatigue sets in, and that's okay. It's because a lot of this album is in the same key, recorded in the same way, with the same instruments and the same treatments. Everything gets to sounding the same. I often had to break up listening between discs to hear anything distinguishing about the second. She's Too Much for My Mirror and Hobo Chang Boss still get lost in my memory. No other album has worn out my ear this way. I did not find a lick of comfort in this.
But AD, can't you just hit the pause button?
Not really! I could lift the needle and absorb what the hell just happened, and I can take a break between sides, but while you get the luxury of just hitting pause, I have to get up, change the record, and drop the needle on this 4 times! Every time! For days, I struggled with how the hell I was gonna structure a Trout Mask Replica review. There's too much to go track by track, but would just sharing my likes and dislikes be a cop-out? Is there a right way to talk about Trout Mask? What could I possibly say about this that someone more knowledgeable about music hasn't already said? Is there even a right way to feel about Trout Mask? It doesn't matter what experience you fall into, category 1, 2, or 3, and someone will still tell you you're wrong. So I'll go with my usual condensed double album format cautiously. There are some positively listenable cuts on Trout Mask. Psych Freakout adjacent Moonlight on Vermont, Lo-Fi Down and Dirty Blues China Pig, almost composed Veterans Day Poppy. God, Veterans Day Poppy is sweet, sweet relief at the end of this. But after all this, Poppy's comfort and modern sounds feel like wearing your slippers on the wrong feet. And there's my personal favorite, Ella Guru. This would have been my pick for a single. It's got the fast and bulbous joke, the texture while not being grating, there's some semblance of a hook. There's parts that are catchy, like the disjointed ascending guitar that begs for a knock-kneed kick line. This one gets stuck in my head the most, but here's the thing. Even the listenable tunes are subverted by stream of consciousness lyrics. Little Nitty with his pistol showin' and his lil pistol totin', well that goes to show you what a moon can do. White moonlight over mountains somehow becomes sexually arousing to these characters. There's allusions to sex, sexual hang-ups, STDs all over this thing. It's like Freudian Dream Analysis the album. It's got more semen than Aeroplane. Nonsensical as the titles and lyrics of X-Ray Gig'em Dresses may be, this honestly reads like fridge magnet poetry. They are on the money. As many allusions as Don uses in his lyrics, thanks to his stark imagery and hair-raising delivery, they end up feeling uncomfortably realistic. Though it may be 15 songs in, Trout Mask still has tricks up its sleeve with Pina. Smiles are wiped by cartoonish, frenzied poetry that sounds like either helium or Verispeed was involved, recited over disembodied screaming. It truly sounds like someone enjoying the sun while sitting on a turned-on waffle iron.
Smoke billowing up from between her legs made me vomit beautifully.
That's some stomach-churning stuff. I don't know whether I should be laughing or screaming too. Lots of other tracks cross into this fire crotch and brimstone grotesquerie. Though its title references mouth stuff, Hair Pie 1 does in fact sound like the horror of cutting into a steaming, sweet-smelling, gorgeous pie to discover a matted cowlick encroached scalp dressing inside. I think the word people are looking for when they describe Trout Mask is arresting. To my ears, Beefheart sounds like if Howlin' Wolf guzzled gasoline straight from the nozzle. Then there's the music, engaged in a sparring match with itself. It's about as stable as a foundation built on sand. In the words of Tom Waits, quote, "To dance to this, there aren't really any existing dances appropriate." You wanna bet? Most of Trout Mask's best moments have one thing in common. Arresting. For example, it doesn't start with any of the listenable cuts, it starts with Frownland. Frownland is a bruising 100 seconds to endure. I can't say if this is intentional or not, but it does a lot of legwork to turn listeners off from Trout Mask, either or get off the pot. It starts in 7/8 time, then descends into what my best friend from high school described in my Movieplex parking lot as, and I quote, "holy polyrhythms." The group effort of arranging this thing made the meters everyone plays in absolutely wild stacked on top of each other. Then you have Don wailing about, "And the sky, and the sun, and all my eyes can see." Like, dude, calm down, you're gonna give yourself an asthma attack. Frownland is a microcosm of the whole of Trout Mask Replica. There's catchy elements like the guitar for the first 15 seconds or so, and this lick right here. The rhythm section is tight, the drumming is great. The accents Drumbo has to throw in lest he drowns in this vat of cold musical spaghetti are genius. But when you zoom out, it's like picking through vomit for chunks. The most consistently shocking thing might be the manner in which Don decides to use his voice. If you listen to literally any Beefheart album besides this, you'll hear that he had a great voice. I read somewhere that he had a 4-octave range. But on cuts like My Human Gets Me Blues, Well, Octafish, and so many more, he uses it like a Southern Baptist preacher running a fever of 104. It makes otherwise casual drabblings like, she pulled up her blouse and compared her navel to the moon. I dig my life for a while. A trip and a half. Having a song about the Holocaust as track 3 is a choice. Talk about arresting. I gotta say, I'm really disappointed that the vocal track was removed for the streaming service version. Why are we censoring this? When Trout Mask was released, we were only 1 generation away from the Holocaust. This song is a sonic expression of, and an important reminder of, one of the most horrific acts in human history. It's ironic considering the line, "The world can't forget that misery." The vocal track of Big Joan is removed too. I have no idea why. It was also one of the best instrumentals on the record. Considering Victor couldn't play the clarinet, his scrambled solo highlights the horrors Don sings of in an impressively acute way, and in the impossibly low end of his vocal range. His voice may be abrasive as hell, but man could he sing. Speaking of screeching, honking woodwind instruments, Hair Pie won! The superior of the Hair Pies for the wheezing, honking saxophone duet. Don and Victor imitate the mating calls of swans with knots tied in their necks. I'm pretty indulgent of, even partial to, the abstract soloing that happens on Trout Mask. Everything about Hair Pie 1 screams intrigue, the interplay between instruments, the muddled Hair Pie 2 in the background, the neighbor kids interrupting to ask what on earth they're hearing and Don accidentally calling it octafish.
Composition is neon meat dream of an octafish. No, it's hair pie.
As much as I appreciate the whack shit, recitations like The Dust Blows Forward, Well, Orange Claw, and Old Fart, which does some really cool stuff with its degradation of fidelity, and instrumentals Hair Pies and DeLee's Car and Undug China Pig, are much-needed palate cleansers. I appreciated The Dust Blows Forward most. It feels like a field recording of a blues man singing to himself. In that way, it's oddly sentimental. And it's funny as hell. The false start at
And a lipstick Kleenex
makes me giggle, and I've been quoting, "Me and my girl named Bimbo, Limbo, Spam," all week. It's cartoony in its reverence and irreverence. The blimp reads like a parody of an old-timey radio show. There's in-jokes all over the place. Fast and Bulbous and Neon Meat Dream of a Octofish function as leitmotifs. I understand humor is very subjective. Not everyone will find Trout Mask funny. But to me, it's funny because of how absurdly committed to the bit it is. Take the intro of Peanut. Don is taking the Fast and Bulbous part so seriously.
Yeah, but you've got to wait until I say.
Also, a tin teardrop.
Christ.
Or Fallen Ditch. Rocket Morton takes off again into the wind. What do you run on, Rocket Morton? Say beans. We also have Pachuco Cadaver. Someone at Bizarre heard, "A squid eating dough in a polyethylene bag is fast and bulbous." Got me? And said, now this is gonna be a hit with the kids. Then you realize that person at Bizarre who chose Cadaver for a single was probably Frank or Don, and the situation comes into focus. If you're trying to get the advancement of music into more people's ears, I don't know if Cadaver was the right choice for a single. Moonlight on Vermont could have been a local hit. It could have sold some amongst the more open-minded listeners of LA, or the particularly acid-dredged of San Francisco. There's really great 60s California grooves buried in this song. The Trout Mask guitar tone is like no other. It can either be harnessed like this, or transformed into screeching razor blades, thanks to slapping a capo on, playing way up the fretboard, and cranking your amp to 10. When the chords form themselves into something remotely familiar, I find myself cheering. Rocket Morton's bass does a lot of work on this record to make that happen, and Gary too on Moonlight on Vermont. They either put the shape in or take the spine out of Trout Mask. Sugar and Spikes would have been a good single too. It could pass for a more out there psych tune. This is a genuinely good instrumental, and it actually sounds like everyone is on the same page. Ant-Man, Bee, and Wildlife have the bones of blues tunes, one in the instruments, the other in vocals, before they go all squiggly and invertebrate. This might be just me, but in the grand scheme of things, Trout Mask really isn't that challenging. If we're talking Zappaverse, Permanent Damage is a lot harder to grasp than Trout Mask. Permanent Damage came from a very specific context, the groupie scene on the Sunset Strip in 1968. Trout Mask came from a specific context too, of course, the LA freak scene in 1968. But it's ever so slightly easier for the typical music fan,
Listeners in their late 20s to middle age, mostly men,
to immerse themselves in. And free jazz gets way weirder than this. For anyone who's ever listened to, written about, or been held hostage by Trout Mask Replica, all our feelings fall somewhere under the umbrella Mark Masters described for Pitchfork. Quote, "Like life in a cult, the music seems crazy to an outside observer, but makes perfect sense once you're inside." Every once in a while, you have an encounter with music that rewires your brain. For better or for worse, this was one of mine. Never before have I sniffed out quirks and intricacies in music like this. The masterful drumming in Sweet Sweet Bulbs, John French, you genius! And ever melodic bass from Rockette Morton, the chemical reactions between Zoothorn Rollo and Antenna Jimmy, the grooves you have to scavenge for. This album is something you have to work at, but it's incredibly rewarding. I'd been wanting to get into Albert Eiler, but I just couldn't grasp that buzzing hornet sound. There was always a way around for me, but never through. Greenwich came on my Spotify once, and for the next 11 months I circled that drain. I listened to Trout Mask a few times. I go to a record store, and there, in the new arrivals bin, I bought it, threw it on my turntable. It's beautiful now. So I'll shake Trout Mask's hand for making me a more adventurous and open-minded music listener, but I'm wearing gloves. I don't want to catch whatever that has. If I had to describe its sound and art, it's the gross side of surrealism mixed with abstract expressionism. Twisted figures in sparse landscapes that melt into evidence of aggressive, impulsive, gesturing motions. Running with the beef theme and surrealist overtones. Think Un Chien Andalou. You know the shot. Considering Dali's car was named for Salvador Dali's Rainy Taxi installation, this might not be too far off. It's the blues, field recordings, and free jazz, the most idiosyncratic record ever made. The combo's got a pungent odor, one that no one has ever and no one will ever be able to replicate. It's one of the few albums in existence that shows you just what happens when the building blocks of music are broken down, completely disassembled, shredded, wet into a pulp, and molded into something completely original. I just really wish it didn't take the guys being put under physical and mental duress to do it. It does make for every musician's respective performances conveying high stakes like no other record I've heard. The biblically accurate arrangements are truly something to behold. Trout Mask Replica is the ultimate trust exercise. But don't worry, it will drop you. My personal favorites off this album are Frownland, The Dust Blows Forward, Ella Guru, Moonlight on Vermont, Hair Pie 1, Octafish, Peanut, and Sugar and Spikes. Remember, if you want to keep up with all of my favorites from all of the Vinyl Mondays, I have a Spotify playlist linked in my description. I update it every week. And that's it! That was the 50,000 subscriber special. That was Trout Mask Replica. What do you think of this album? What do you think of Captain Beefheart? Leave a comment letting me know. I love hearing what you guys have to say about albums that I love. And remember, despite what some guy on the internet will tell you, your opinion matters. If you like what I do here, you should like this video and subscribe to my channel. I post new episodes of Vinyl Monday, Monday mornings at 11, and a new episode of the Dolls podcast every other Friday at noon. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye!